Imagine standing in a land where brothers fought brothers, where fields of green turned red, and where the future of a nation was decided not in quiet rooms, but in thunderous gunfire. This is the story of a war that was not only fought for land, but for the soul of a country. A war that began with political tension, grew into violent separation, and ended by reshaping the meaning of freedom itself. In the next minutes, you will witness the real causes, the bloodiest battles, and the powerful turning point that changed history forever. You will see how one nation stood on the edge of collapse, and how survival demanded sacrifice. Do not skip this story, because this is not just Civil War history. This is the story of America's most painful and most defining moment. We'll explain everything in this video step by step. Don't skip it. In the spring of 1861, a nation born in revolution stood trembling at the edge of its own undoing. For decades, the United States had called itself indivisible. It had survived foreign invasion, political turmoil, and bitter elections. But beneath the soaring language of liberty in the Declaration of Independence, beneath the marble promises of the Constitution, there lived a contradiction, one so profound that it would one day demand blood as its answer. That contradiction was slavery. The American Civil War did not begin overnight. It began in whispers, compromises written in careful ink, debates in candlelit chambers, sermons from pulpits north and south. It began in 1820 with the Missouri Compromise, in 1850 with another uneasy bargain, in 1854 when the Kansas-Nebraska Act tore open the question of whether new territories would be slave or free. Each compromise was less a solution than a postponement. The nation kept kicking the can down a dusty road that was narrowing with every mile. The causes of the Civil War were not simple, but they were clear. At its heart was slavery, an institution woven into the Southern economy and social order. Cotton was king, and cotton was harvested by enslaved hands. By 1860, nearly 4 million African Americans were enslaved in the South. For Southern leaders, slavery was not merely an economic system. It was, in their minds, a way of life. They believed it to be sanctioned by history, by tradition, even by God. In the North, however, industrialization was reshaping society. Factories rose where plantations did not. Immigrants poured into cities. While not all Northerners were abolitionists, many opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories. They feared its political power. They feared its moral cost. And some, moved by conscience, condemned it outright as a sin against humanity, Sectionalism deepened. Newspapers inflamed passions. Political parties fractured. The Supreme Court's 1857 Dred Scott decision declared that African Americans could not be citizens and that Congress had no power to prohibit slavery in the territories. For many in the North, it felt as if the very machinery of government had been captured by slaveholding interests. Then came the election of 1860. When Abraham Lincoln won the presidency without carrying a single Southern state, the message to many in the South was unmistakable. They had lost control of the federal government. Lincoln had promised not to interfere with slavery where it already existed, but he opposed its expansion. To Southern fire eaters, that was threat enough. Beginning in December 1860, South Carolina seceded from the Union. By February 1861, 6 more states had followed. They formed the Confederate States of America and elected Jefferson Davis as their president. They claimed they were defending states' rights, but the right at the center of their cause was the right to own human beings. On April 12, 1861, the waiting ended. Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. After 34 hours of bombardment, the Union garrison surrendered. The Civil War had begun. From 1861 to 1865, the United States would be transformed into a battlefield. The First Battle of Bull Run in July 1861 shattered illusions of a short war. Civilians had arrived with picnic baskets to watch what they assumed would be a swift Union victory. Instead, they witnessed chaos and retreat. It became painfully clear this would not be a brief rebellion. It would be a long and terrible reckoning. In the Western theater, battles raged along rivers that served as lifelines. At Shiloh in April 1862, Union forces under Ulysses S. Grant survived a surprise Confederate attack in Tennessee. The carnage shocked the nation. More Americans fell in 2 days at Shiloh than in all previous American wars combined. But it was in the East that the war seized the imagination of the world. In September 1862, near Antietam Creek in Maryland, Union and Confederate armies clashed in what remains the bloodiest single day in American history. Over 22,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing. The fields ran red. Yet the battle provided Lincoln with something he desperately needed, a strategic victory. Days later, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that enslaved people in rebelling states shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. The war, once fought solely to preserve the Union, now took on a new and moral dimension. Freedom had entered the battlefield. In July 1863, the war reached a turning point in the small town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. For 3 days, Union and Confederate forces collided in brutal combat. On the third day, General Robert E. Lee ordered a daring assault known as Pickett's Charge. Confederate soldiers marched across open fields into a storm of Union fire. They were cut down in staggering numbers. Lee's invasion of the North failed. The tide had begun to turn. That same month in the West, Grant captured Vicksburg, Mississippi, gaining control of the Mississippi River and splitting the Confederacy in two. The Union strategy of strangulation, known as the Anaconda Plan, was tightening. By 1864, the war had become a grinding contest of endurance. Grant, now commanding all Union armies, understood that the North's industrial strength and manpower could prevail in a war of attrition. He pursued Lee relentlessly in Virginia, at the Wilderness, at Spotsylvania, at Cold Harbor. Casualties mounted. Trenches scarred the earth in a grim preview of wars yet to come. Meanwhile, General William Tecumseh Sherman marched through Georgia, capturing Atlanta and then setting out on his march to the sea. His campaign targeted not only Confederate armies, but the infrastructure that sustained them. Railroads were twisted into Sherman's neckties. Warehouses burned. The message was unmistakable. The Confederacy could no longer protect its own heartland. By April 1865, the Confederacy was exhausted. Richmond fell. Lee's army, starving and outnumbered, retreated westward. On April 9, 1865, at Appomattox Courthouse, Lee surrendered to Grant. The terms were generous. There would be no executions for treason. Officers could keep their sidearms. Soldiers could return home with their horses. To plant spring crops. The guns fell silent. The Civil War lasted 4 years, from April 12, 1861 to April 12, 1865. It claimed more than 600,000 lives, perhaps more. It left cities in ruins, families shattered, a nation scarred beyond recognition. And yet from that crucible came a new birth of freedom. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th promised equal protection under the law. The 15th sought to protect the right to vote. The Constitution, once compromised by slavery, was rewritten in the language of liberty. But victory did not erase hatred. Reconstruction would bring its own struggles, its own betrayals. The promise of equality would remain unfinished, contested for generations. Still, the Civil War stands as the defining test of the American experiment. It answered a question that had lingered since 1776. Could a nation conceived in liberty endure? The answer came at terrible cost, but it came. The war was not inevitable, but it became unavoidable. When it became unavoidable, when compromise could no longer bridge the moral chasm at the nation's core, it was fought by farmers and factory workers, immigrants and freedmen, generals and privates whose names history has forgotten. It was fought in cornfields and forests, along rivers and railroads, in towns that had never imagined becoming sacred ground. And in the end, it was not only a war over territory or political power. It was a war over the meaning of freedom itself. The echoes of that struggle still live with us, in debates over justice, in questions of equality, in the ongoing effort to form a more perfect union. The Civil War reminds us that nations, like people, must confront their deepest contradictions, or be consumed by the few found stillness in these words. Subscribe to join this space of presence and share your deepest now in the comments below. In the early decades of the 19th, in the century, the United States was a young republic with an old wound. The language of liberty rang from courthouse steps and echoed in school books, yet beneath that noble vocabulary lay a system of human bondage that shaped the nation's economy, politics, and conscience. Slavery was not a regional curiosity. It was a national contradiction. Cotton grown by enslaved labor in the Deep South fed textile mills in New England and factories in Great Britain. Northern banks financed Southern plantations. Ships built in northern ports carried Southern harvests across the Atlantic. The wealth of the Republic, in ways both visible and hidden, bore the fingerprints of enslaved hands. As the country expanded westward, the question followed, Would new territories permit slavery, or would they be free soil? Each new state threatened to upset the delicate balance of power in Congress. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 attempted to draw a geographic line across the Louisiana Purchase, dividing future slave and free territories. For a time, it calmed tempers, but it did not resolve the underlying moral and political dispute. It merely postponed it. The line on the map was less a solution than a truce, and truces have a way of expiring. In the South, slavery was defended not only as an economic necessity, but as a social order. Planters argued that their agricultural system, built on tobacco, rice, sugar, and above all cotton, required a stable, controlled labor force. By 1860, nearly 4 million African Americans were enslaved, forming the backbone of a plantation economy that produced the majority of the world's cotton. Southern intellectuals and politicians increasingly described slavery as a positive good, claiming it civilized those in bondage and created harmony between races. This paternalistic rhetoric masked a brutal reality: families separated at auction blocks, whippings in the fields, literacy forbidden by law, and lives defined by coercion. In the North, the economic landscape was changing. Industry expanded, cities grew, and waves of immigrants reshaped urban life. Free labor, work performed for wages, became a defining ideal. Many Northerners did not see themselves as crusaders for racial equality, yet they feared the spread of slavery into Western territories. They believed that slavery degraded labor and threatened opportunities for white workers seeking land and independence. The debate was not only moral but practical. What kind of society would define the American future? As religion intensified the divide, the Second Great Awakening stirred evangelical fervor across the country, and many Protestant ministers began to denounce slavery as a sin. Abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison demanded immediate emancipation, publishing fiery editorials that called the institution a crime against God and humanity. Frederick Douglass, once enslaved, spoke with piercing clarity about the hypocrisy of a nation that celebrated freedom while chaining millions. His speeches forced audiences to confront the gap between American ideals and American practices. Yet for every abolitionist voice, there were defenders of the Southern way of life. Southern politicians argued that states had the sovereign right to regulate their own institutions without interference from the federal government. The doctrine of states' rights became a shield behind which slavery stood protected. When Congress debated tariffs, internal improvements, or territorial governance, the underlying fear remained constant. Would federal authority one day be used to restrict or abolish slavery? The 1850s proved combustible. The Compromise of 1850 admitted California as a free state, but strengthened the Fugitive Slave Act, requiring citizens, even in free states, to assist in the capture of escaped enslaved people. The law turned ordinary Northerners into reluctant participants in the machinery of slavery. Scenes of alleged fugitives dragged through northern streets under federal guard shocked communities and hardened opposition. Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, gave human faces to the suffering of the enslaved, selling hundreds of thousands of copies and shaping public sentiment. Then came the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which repealed the Missouri Compromise line and allowed settlers in new territories to decide the slavery question by popular sovereignty. The result was violence. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded into Kansas, and the territory descended into bloodshed. Bleeding Kansas became a grim symbol of a nation, unable to contain its own conflict. Armed men fought over polling places and burned each other's homes, as if the Civil War were rehearsing its opening act. The Supreme Court's decision in the Dred Scott case in 1857 deepened the crisis. The court ruled that African Americans could not be citizens and that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in the territories. The decision effectively nationalized slavery, declaring that slaveholders could carry their human property into any territory. For many in the North, it was a stunning blow. The highest court in the land had endorsed a vision of America in which black lives held no constitutional protection. Political parties fractured under the strain. The Whig Party collapsed. A new political force, the Republican Party, emerged with a platform opposing the expansion of slavery. Its members were a coalition: former Whigs, Free Soilers, anti-slavery Democrats, united not necessarily by a shared vision of racial equality, but by a determination to halt slavery's spread. Southern leaders watched this development with mounting alarm. They feared that containment would lead to eventual extinction. The debate was no longer abstract. It entered homes and hearts. Families argued at dinner tables. Newspapers printed editorials that dripped with accusation. Preachers thundered from pulpits. Each election felt existential. Compromise, once a hallmark of American politics, grew elusive. The language of union gave way to the language of separation. At its core, sectional division was about identity as much as policy. The North and South began to see themselves not merely as regions, but as distinct civilizations. One prided itself on industry, free labor, and reform movements. The other rooted its identity in agrarian tradition, honor, and a hierarchical social structure. These self-conceptions hardened into stereotypes, then into suspicions, and finally into open hostility. By the eve of the 1860 election, the fault lines were unmistakable. Southern states warned that the victory of a Republican president would be intolerable. Many Northerners, in turn, believed that yielding further to slaveholding demands would betray the nation's founding promise. The Union, once held together by shared sacrifice in the Revolution and common pride in westward expansion, now strained under incompatible visions of freedom. Slavery was not a side issue. It was the engine driving the conflict. Economic interests, political doctrines, cultural identities, all circled around the institution of human bondage. It shaped laws, elections, court decisions, and daily life. It determined who could vote, who could testify in court, who could claim ownership of their own body. The sectional divide was not simply a disagreement over policy. It was a collision between two moral universes, coexisting within one republic. One side insisted that liberty was universal, even if imperfectly realized. The other insisted that liberty could coexist with perpetual servitude for millions. The tension between those visions stretched across decades, tightening with every territorial debate, every courtroom ruling, every whispered story of escape along the Underground Railroad. As the country moved closer to war, compromise became indistinguishable from surrender in the eyes of extremists on both sides. Trust eroded, fear replaced patience, and the Union, conceived in compromise, found itself unable to reconcile the deepest contradiction at its heart. If you found stillness in these words, subscribe to Join the Space of Presence and share your deepest now in the comments below. By 1860, the United States was no longer arguing politely about slavery. It was bracing for a reckoning. The election that year did not create the nation's divisions, but it exposed them with unforgiving clarity. Political parties had splintered along sectional lines, and the old language of national unity rang hollow against the clang of suspicion and fear. For many Americans, the ballot box felt less like a civic ritual and more like a battlefield. The Democratic Party, once a national coalition, fractured dramatically. Northern Democrats nominated Stephen A. Douglas, who championed popular sovereignty, the idea that settlers in each territory should decide for themselves whether to permit slavery. Southern Democrats, distrustful of Douglas and convinced that federal protection of slavery was essential, walked out of the convention and nominated John C. Breckinridge. A fourth candidate, John Bell of the Constitutional Union Party, pleaded for compromise and preservation of the Union without addressing slavery directly. The election became a four-way contest reflecting a nation that could no longer speak with one voice. The Republican Party, only 6 years old, nominated Abraham Lincoln, a former congressman from Illinois whose debates with Douglas had elevated him to national prominence. Lincoln was not an abolitionist in the mold of William Lloyd Garrison, but he was firm in his opposition to the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. He believed that the founders had placed slavery on a path toward eventual extinction and that its spread would nationalize and perpetuate an injustice incompatible with democratic ideals. To Southern leaders, however, Lincoln represented a direct threat not because he promised immediate abolition where slavery already existed, but because he embodied a political movement determined to contain it. When the votes were counted in November 1860, Lincoln won the presidency with a decisive majority in the Electoral College, but less than 40% of the popular vote. Not a single Southern state cast its electoral votes for him. Not a single Southern state cast its electoral votes for him. The map of the election returns revealed a stark sectional divide. The North carried Lincoln to victory. The South rejected him entirely. In many Southern communities, church bells did not ring in celebration but tolled in alarm. Newspapers warned of subjugation. Politicians spoke of honor and survival. For decades, Southern leaders had warned that the election of a president hostile to slavery's expansion would justify secession. Now, in their view, that moment had arrived. They argued that the Union was a voluntary compact among sovereign states and that any state retained the right to withdraw if its interests were threatened. Secession, they claimed, was not rebellion but a constitutional remedy. Beneath the legal language, however, lay a deeper fear that the political power of slaveholding states was slipping away irreversibly. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina became the first state to secede. Its Ordinance of Secession declared that the election of a sectional president had broken the compact of union. Other Deep South states followed, loud in swift succession: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. Delegates gathered in conventions, voted, and raised new flags over state houses. In February 1861, representatives from the seceded states met in Montgomery, Alabama, to form the Confederate States of America. They adopted a constitution strikingly similar to that of the United States, but with explicit protections for slavery. Jefferson Davis of Mississippi was chosen as president. The crisis unfolded during the final months of President James' administration, Edgar Cahn's administration. Buchanan believed secession was illegal, but also believed the federal government lacked authority to coerce a state back into the Union. His inaction created a vacuum, and that vacuum filled with uncertainty. Federal forts and arsenals in the South became flashpoints. Some were seized by state militias. Others remained in Union hands, isolated and vulnerable. Lincoln, meanwhile, prepared to assume office under extraordinary circumstances. He traveled to Washington amid rumors of assassination plots. When he delivered his inaugural address on March 4, 1861, he spoke with deliberate restraint. He reassured the South that he had no intention of interfering with slavery, where it already existed. He appealed to the better angels of our nature. Yet he also declared that the Union was perpetual and that secession was legally void. The government, he insisted, would hold its property and enforce the laws.
The most volatile of those properties was Fort Sumter, a federal installation in Charleston Harbor.
Major Robert Anderson commanded a small Union garrison there, surrounded by Confederate forces demanding surrender. Supplies were dwindling. Lincoln faced a terrible dilemma: withdraw and implicitly recognize Confederate authority or resupply the fort and risk war. He chose to send provisions notifying South Carolina authorities that the ships carried food, not weapons. In the early hours of April 12, 1861, Confederate batteries opened fire on Fort Sumter. For 34 hours, artillery shells arc across the harbor, exploding against the fort's walls. Anderson's men returned fire, but were outmatched. On April 13th, the fort surrendered. No soldiers were killed in the bombardment itself, yet the symbolic impact was immense. The Union had been fired upon. The fragile hope that secession might proceed without bloodshed evaporated in smoke over Charleston Harbor. Lincoln responded by calling for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. His proclamation transformed a political crisis into a military confrontation. Upper South states that had hesitated now faced a choice: remain in a Union preparing to use force against fellow Southerners, or join the Confederacy. Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina chose secession. Richmond became the Confederate capital. The divide hardened into two organized governments, each claiming legitimacy, each preparing for a conflict neither fully comprehended. Communities were torn apart. In border states like Kentucky and Missouri, loyalties were split, sometimes within the same household. Brothers chose different uniforms. Neighbors who had shared harvests now eyed one another with suspicion. The rhetoric of rights and sovereignty gave way to the reality of mobilization. Training camps filling with young men, factories converting to wartime production, newspapers publishing casualty lists. Secession had been framed as a peaceful assertion of independence, but the attack on Fort Sumter made clear that the Union would not dissolve quietly. What began as a constitutional dispute over federal authority and states' rights was inseparable from the institution of slavery that undergirded it. The election of Lincoln crystallized decades of tension into decisive action. Secession conventions spoke openly of protecting slavery as central to their cause. The Confederacy's own vice president, Alexander Stephens, declared that its foundations rested upon the great truth of racial inequality. The breaking point was not merely political, it was psychological. Trust between sections had eroded beyond repair. Compromise measures proposed in the winter of 1860-61 failed to gain sufficient support. Each side doubted the other's sincerity. Each interpreted concession as weakness. The firing on Fort Sumter ended debate and began mobilization. What had been argued in legislative halls would now be contested on fields and rivers. The Union and the Confederacy stood facing one another, flags raised, convinced of their respective righteousness. The election had revealed the fracture. Secession had widened it. The guns at Charleston made it undeniable that the American experiment would be tested not by words but by war. The Civil War did not turn on a single battle, but history often remembers moments when fate seemed to pause and choose a direction. Between 1862 and 1863, the conflict entered a phase where scale, strategy, and human endurance collided in ways that would permanently reshape the meaning of war in America. The early optimism that the war might end quickly had long vanished. Instead, armies marched, trained, starved, and fought in landscapes that swallowed men by the thousands. One of the earliest shocks to the American conscience came with the clash at Battle of Antietam in September 1862. The fighting took place near a quiet stream known as Antietam Creek in Maryland, but the tranquility of the setting belied the horror that unfolded. It remains the single bloodiest day in American military history. Soldiers fought across cornfields, sunken roads, and open pastures that quickly became killing grow. Undress rifles fired with deadly efficiency at ranges that made survival a matter of luck as much as skill. The armies were led by two commanders who embodied the strategic tension of the war. On one side stood Robert E. Lee, commanding the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, a man admired by both friends and enemies for his tactical brilliance and personal dignity. On the other stood George B. McClellan, who commanded the Union Army of the Potomac but hesitated repeatedly to press his advantage despite possessing superior numbers. The confrontation between Lee's audacity and McClellan's caution shaped the battle's outcome. The battle itself unfolded in brutal stages. Confederate and Union forces traded assaults at locations that would later be remembered by name: the cornfield, the sunken road, later called Bloody Lane, and the bridge across Antietam Creek that Union troops fought desperately to capture. Soldiers fired until smoke blurred vision. Commanders struggled to maintain formation amid chaos. Medical facilities were overwhelmed by the wounded. By the end of the day, more than 22,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing. The battlefield became a silent testimony to industrial age warfare, where improved firearms increased lethality without providing corresponding advances in battlefield medicine. Farmers would later return to fields where crops once grew and find soil stained and scattered with the equipment of war. Antietam did not produce a decisive tactical victory, but it halted Lee's invasion of the North. The strategic significance of Antietam extended far beyond Maryland soil. The battle gave President Abraham Lincoln the political and military opportunity he needed to transform the purpose of the war. Until that moment, the Union's primary objective had been the preservation of national unity. Lincoln had been cautious about framing the conflict as a crusade against slavery, fearing that border states might join the Confederacy. If abolition became an immediate war aim, 5 days after the Union claimed a strategic advantage at Antietam, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. The document declared that enslaved people in Confederate-controlled territories shall be thenceforward, and forever free. It did not immediately free enslaved individuals in border states loyal to the Union, nor did it abolish slavery nationwide. That would require constitutional amendment. But it fundamentally redefined the war's meaning. The proclamation transformed the Union cause into something morally larger than territorial preservation. It allowed the recruitment of African American soldiers into the Union Army, leading to the formation of units such as the United States Colored Troops. These soldiers fought not only for the survival of the Union, but for the promise that freedom could extend beyond paper declarations. Meanwhile, the Confederacy faced mounting logistical and manpower challenges. Its agricultural economy struggled to sustain long campaigns, especially as Union naval blockades tightened along southern ports. The war was becoming not only a contest of armies, but a contest of industrial capacity, transportation networks, and population resources. The turning point of the war's military momentum is often associated with the summer of 1863 and the Battle of Gettysburg. The conflict took place in the small town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where Confederate forces under Lee attempted a bold invasion of Northern Territory. The battle unfolded over 3 days, from July 1st to July 3rd, across ridges, hills, and open ground that would later become etched into American memory. The fighting reached its most dramatic and tragic climax on the third day, during an assault known as Pickett's Charge. Thousands of Confederate infantrymen marched across nearly a mile of open field toward fortified Union positions. The advance was disciplined and solemn, a military movement that combined courage with fatal inevitability. Union artillery and rifle fire tore into the formation. Many soldiers fell before reaching the defensive lines. Gettysburg resulted in roughly 50,000 combined casualties and forced Lee to retreat southward. It marked the end of major Confederate offensives into Northern territory. The psychological effect was enormous. The Confederacy had gambled on breaking Northern morale through invasion, and the gamble failed. At the same time, Union forces achieved another strategic triumph in the West during the siege of Vicksburg. Under the command of Union General Ulysses S. Grant, Union troops conducted a prolonged siege against Confederate forces defending the city of Vicksburg, Mississippi. The city occupied a critical position along the Mississippi River. The capture of Vicksburg on July 4, 1863, was symbolically powerful and strategically decisive. It gave the Union control of the Mississippi River, effectively splitting the Confederacy into eastern and western theaters. Supplies, troops, and communication lines across the South became increasingly difficult to maintain. Grant's military philosophy emphasized relentless pressure. He understood that Northern advantages in population, industry, and transportation could overwhelm Confederate resistance over time. His strategy marked a shift from maneuver warfare toward attritional warfare where sustained engagement would gradually exhaust enemy resources. The combination of victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg represented what historians often consider the war's turning point. The Confederacy was not immediately defeated, but its ability to achieve strategic victory had been severely weakened. Internal recognition of the Confederacy, which Southern leaders had hoped for, became far less likely. Beyond the battlefield, the war was also transforming American society. The moral language of freedom became more central to national identity. Soldiers wrote letters describing their understanding of the war's purpose. Some fought to preserve the Union. Others fought to end slavery. Still others fought for duty, community, or survival. The battles of Antietam, Gettysburg, and Vicksburg together revealed the war's brutal arithmetic. Victory would not come through a single decisive clash, but through sustained endurance. The human cost was staggering. Fields that once produced food now produced graves. Hospitals overflowed. Surgeons worked under conditions that modern medicine would consider unimaginable. The year 1863 marked the moment when the war's outcome began to tilt, not suddenly, but inexorably toward Union victory. The Confederacy could still fight, still resist, still hope, but the strategic momentum had shifted. The war was becoming a test of which society could sustain suffering longer without breaking. The soldiers who marched through those battles were often young, many barely adults, carrying weapons heavier than their experience. They fought in uniforms that would soon be stained with dust, sweat, and blood. They marched toward gunfire because their governments, their communities, or their convictions told them it was necessary. History remembers the generals and presidents, but the war was decided by thousands of unnamed individuals, standing in long lines of fire. Their sacrifices transformed not only military history, but the moral trajectory of the nation. In the midst of war, when armies clashed and cities burned, the meaning of the conflict itself began to change. What had started as a struggle over union and governance evolved into a battle of the future of human freedom in America. By 1863, the war's political and moral trajectory was shaped decisively by one of the most consequential documents in American history, the Emancipation Proclamation issued by Abraham Lincoln. The proclamation was not simply a wartime decree. It was a statement that redefined the purpose of the Union's struggle and placed the institution of slavery at the center of national survival. Lincoln approached the issue of emancipation with caution and strategic patience. Early in the war, he had focused primarily on preserving the Union rather than immediately confronting slavery in the states where it already existed. This political restraint was not born from indifference, but from calculation. Several border states, including Kentucky and Maryland, remained loyal to the Union but permitted slavery within their borders. Lincoln feared that an aggressive abolitionist policy might push these states into the Confederacy, strengthening the enemy's manpower and geographic position. The military situation by 1862, however, forced a reevaluation. Union victories were inconsistent, and the Confederacy continued to demonstrate resilience under commanders such as Robert E. Lee. Lincoln came to believe that weakening the Confederate labor system could also weaken its war-making capacity. Slavery was not only a moral issue, but a strategic resource supporting Southern agriculture, logistics, and social structure. The opportunity to issue the proclamation was closely tied to the Union victory at Battle of Antietam. Although Antietam was tactically inconclusive, it provided the political justification Lincoln needed. Without a Union victory, announcing emancipation might have appeared desperate or illegitimate in the eyes of both domestic and international observers. Timing mattered as much as principle. On September 22, 1862, Lincoln issued the preliminary proclamation warning Confederate states that if they did not return to the Union by January 1, 1863, their enslaved populations would be declared free. Southern governments ignored the warning. As promised, Lincoln issued the final proclamation at the beginning of 1863. The document declared that all persons held as slaves in rebellious territories were forever free. Yet its legal scope was carefully limited. It did not apply to border states that had remained loyal to the Union, nor did it immediately abolish slavery nationwide. Instead, it targeted regions under Confederate control. This limitation reflected both constitutional constraints and political necessity. Lincoln framed the proclamation as a military measure justified under his authority as commander-in-chief during wartime. The proclamation had profound international implications. European powers, particularly Britain and France, had debated whether to recognize the Confederacy as an independent nation. The presence of slavery complicated diplomatic relations. Public opinion in Britain, where abolitionist sentiment had grown since the early 19th century, became increasingly hostile to supporting a slaveholding rebellion. The proclamation made it politically difficult for European governments to intervene on behalf of the Confederacy. Perhaps one of the most transformative consequences of the proclamation was its impact on African American participation in the war. The Union Army began recruiting formerly enslaved and free black men into military service, forming units such as the United States Colored Troops. These soldiers faced discrimination in pay, equipment, and assignments, often being placed in more dangerous combat roles or labor-intensive tasks. Yet their service carried enormous symbolic significance. Approximately 180,000 African American soldiers eventually served Union forces. Their presence transformed the character of the war. For many, enlistment represented more than military service. It was a claim to citizenship and human dignity. Letters written by black soldiers during the war frequently expressed a determination to prove that freedom and bravery were inseparable. The proclamation also altered the psychological landscape of the conflict. Confederate leaders recognized that emancipation threatened the foundation of their social system. Enslaved labor had been essential not only for agricultural production, but also for supporting Confederate armies through food supply, transportation, and construction. Some enslaved individuals fled plantations and sought protection behind Union lines, creating what became known as contraband camps, communities that formed near Union military installations. Within the Union itself, the proclamation generated controversy. Some Northern Democrats criticized Lincoln for expanding war aims beyond Union preservation. They argued that emancipation would transform the conflict into a racial revolution rather than a constitutional dispute. Others feared that freed slaves would migrate northward and compete for labor opportunities. Lincoln faced political pressure from multiple directions, yet he believed that ending slavery was essential to securing a lasting peace. The proclamation's moral language also reshaped national identity. It introduced the idea that the Union was fighting not merely for territory, but for a universal principle of human freedom. The American experiment, once founded on compromise with slavery, was now publicly committed to its destruction in rebellious regions. On battlefields, the proclamation influenced soldier motivation. Union troops increasingly viewed their mission through a moral framework. Some soldiers who had initially joined simply to preserve the Union came to believe they were participating in a historic struggle against human bondage. Confederate soldiers, by contrast, often interpreted the proclamation as confirmation that the war aimed to destroy their social order. The proclamation did not end slavery immediately. In areas still under Confederate control, slavery continued until Union armies advanced and enforced the decree. The ultimate legal abolition of slavery required the later ratification of the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution. Historians often view the Emancipation Proclamation as one of the most significant strategic and moral decisions of the Civil War. It transformed the international perception of the conflict, expanded Union manpower, undermined Confederate economic foundations, and aligned the war effort with the promise of freedom. It also marked a turning point in American history, where the survival of the nation became explicitly connected to the destruction of slavery. Yet the proclamation also reflected the complexity of wartime leadership. It was both a military strategy and a moral statement, both a political calculation and a philosophical declaration. Lincoln understood that wars are not won by armies alone, but by the ideas that sustain them. The proclamation was, in many ways, a weapon of belief as much as a weapon of policy. By 1865, the long and brutal conflict that had consumed the United States for 4 years was approaching its final chapter. The Confederacy, weakened by continuous military pressure, economic exhaustion, and shrinking manpower, could no longer sustain large-scale resistance against the Union forces commanded by Ulysses S. Grant. Grant's strategy of relentless engagement had transformed Northern military doctrine. Instead of seeking single decisive victories, he pursued constant pressure against Confederate armies, supply lines, and infrastructure. This approach reflected a new understanding of industrial-era warfare, where endurance and resources mattered as much as battlefield tactics. The political leadership of the Union remained focused on preserving national unity while also securing the freedom that had been promised through wartime policy. President Abraham Lincoln entered 1865, believing that victory was within reach, but also aware that military triumph alone would not heal the country's divisions. The nation faced not only the collapse of a rebellion, but the challenge of rebuilding a society that had been structured around slavery for generations. In April 1865, Confederate resistance reached its breaking point. The Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia, fell to Union forces after prolonged siege operations and shortages of food and ammunition. Fires broke out in the city as Confederate forces withdrew, leaving behind destroyed warehouses and government buildings. The symbolic heart of the Confederacy had been captured, signaling that organized Southern resistance was nearing its end. The final military chapter of the war unfolded at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865. Confederate Commander Robert E. Lee faced overwhelming strategic reality. His army was exhausted, surrounded, and outnumbered. Supplies were dangerously low, and further resistance would likely result in unnecessary destruction and loss of life. Lee chose surrender as a military and humanitarian decision, rather than continue what he believed would be a hopeless struggle. The surrender terms offered by Grant were notable for their generosity. Confederate officers were permitted to retain their personal sidearms and horses, allowing them to return home with dignity. Soldiers were instructed to register and receive parole papers, promising not to take up arms again against the Union. The Union Army also distributed ions to hungry Confederate soldiers, reflecting a desire to transition from war to reconciliation rather than revenge. News of the surrender spread slowly across a nation still recovering from years of violence. In northern cities, church bells rang. Crowds gathered in streets and spontaneous celebrations erupted. Many Americans felt relief that the nightmare of mass warfare was finally ending. In the South, reactions were more complex. Some communities mourned the loss of their cause, while others felt exhaustion more than political loyalty. Homes had lost sons, fields had been neglected, and economic structures were collapsing under the pressure of war's destruction. The assassination of President Lincoln on April 14, 1865, only days after the surrender, shocked the nation and cast a shadow over the promise of peaceful Reconstruction. Lincoln's death complicated the political future of the country. Leadership passed to Vice President Andrew Johnson, whose approach to rebuilding the South would differ significantly from Lincoln's vision. Johnson favored rapid restoration of Southern states to the Union with limited federal intervention, a policy that would later generate intense political conflict. The period following the war became known as Reconstruction, during which the United States attempted to rebuild Southern infrastructure, redefine citizenship, and integrate formerly enslaved people into national life. Congress passed constitutional amendments to secure civil rights and dismantle the legal foundation of slavery. The 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution formally abolished slavery throughout the nation, marking the legal end of the institution that had shaped American history for centuries. Yet legal freedom did not automatically translate into social or economic equality. Many freed individuals faced poverty, discrimination, and uncertainty about employment and land ownership. Former plantations were often restored to white ownership, and systems such as sharecropping emerged, binding many freed families to cycles of debt and agricultural labor. Political Reconstruction also produced new tensions. Some Southern states resisted federal policies through the establishment of restrictive local laws designed to limit the mobility, voting rights, and economic opportunities of African Americans. Federal troops were stationed in parts of the South to enforce constitutional protections, but enforcement varied across regions. The war had fundamentally altered American society. Approximately 600,000 soldiers and civilians had died, making the Civil War the deadliest conflict in American history. Entire communities had been emptied of young men. Cities and farms bore physical scars from campaigns and sieges. Railroads, bridges, and industrial centers required reconstruction. The Union victory preserved the territorial integrity of the United States, but the deeper question of equality remained unresolved. The constitutional amendments that followed the war represented an attempt to transform the nation's founding principles into enforceable law. The 14th Amendment established citizenship and equal protection, while the 15th Amendment sought to protect voting rights regardless of race, though enforcement challenges would persist for generations. The Civil War era ultimately reshaped the meaning of American freedom. The nation that entered the conflict divided by slavery emerged with slavery legally destroyed but social equality still uncertain. The war demonstrated that democratic societies can fracture when moral contradictions are left unresolved. T also showed that national survival sometimes requires confronting injustice at its root rather than postponing difficult questions. The legacy of 1865 lived on in the memories of veterans, the struggles of freed families. The struggles of freed families and the ongoing debate over the promise of equality embedded within American constitutional ideals. If you found stillness in these words, subscribe to join the space of presence and share your deepest now in the comments below. Subcrips thanks for watching this video, and don't forget to like and not